Thank you for joining us today on our webinar. My name is Wayne Weingarten. I'm a senior fellow with the Pacific Research Institute, and I'm so pleased that today we have a New York Times best-selling author, Carol Roth. She has just produced a new book. It's called The War on Small Business. It's available today online at your favorite bookseller, and having read it, I cannot praise it enough. It raises so many important issues. And why small businesses are so important, in that the regulatory assault that is being waged before the pandemic and during the pandemic, it's harming small business, which is going to kind of lead to a less prosperous future. And I guess with that, I would love to kind of just to dive in and start discussing what's wrong. Why are we harming what is really the heart of our economy? And so I guess, Carol, I'd like to start talking about, why is this, in your opinion, why was this such an important topic for us to get into?
It's interesting when I talk to people about how many big businesses versus small businesses there are in this country. Most people don't have a really good sense of the scope. They think there are millions of big businesses and the sort of like niche of small business, but it's actually the reverse. We have somewhere between 10 and 15,000 large businesses in this country. And before COVID, we had 30.2 million small businesses, 6 million of which had employees, and it accounted for about half the GDP and about half the employment of this country. So it really is a very significant part of the economy overall. And it's also just an important path for economic freedom. If you think about the path for wealth creation comes with ownership. And so small business enables anybody, and we have people from all over the globe who like to come here to try to pursue that economic freedom, pursue that wealth creation, or in some cases, just other kinds of freedom, flexibility to do what they want or to pursue a passion or whatnot. And so preserving that opportunity and then the decentralization that comes along with small business and really looks a lot more like free market capitalism than a lot of the big businesses do, make it so critically important. But man, Wayne, I tell you, everyone says how important small business is, and we certainly hear it from politicians, and we do not have enough people walking the talk. So I'm thrilled that you're giving this important discussion a platform.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, when you were just talking, and small businesses, at least my view, is even more important, because not only are they 50% of the economy, but they're the 50% that's innovative, right? That those large businesses are going to come from somebody's garage today. And so we're stopping that entrepreneurial path to come up with new ideas, because large businesses, they're all about bureaucracy and cronyism and all these other problems that the true free market is in the small business.
Yeah, I mean, you do forget that every big business that exists today, with the exception of maybe something that was spun off of a bigger entity, started as that small business. It is the stepping stone to big business. But unfortunately, when you disrupt that, whether it's disrupting capital allocation or risk taking, or just wholesale shutting them down, it makes it much more difficult to get the incentives to have those businesses continue to innovate. I wrote a book 10 years ago about all the risks to small business and how hard it is to run a small business. And it's really not for the faint of heart, and a lot of them fail to succeed. But never did I think that the government was going to be the #1 risk to small business, and we'd be in a situation where they were just going to wholesale shut them down. Yet 15 months later, here we are.
That's right. Well, and I'd love to kind of just dive into that, because to me, one of the important contributions of your book is, one, there's been a regulatory assault, and would love to talk about that as well. But the pandemic, people talk about how we needed to support small businesses, and we spent money on the idea that we needed to support small businesses, yet all of the policies were kind of geared towards, in practice, harming small businesses. I guess before we get into that, one of the things you talk about in the book, and to me it was one of the most important parts, is you start with the timeline, and you start to say the pandemic is just as much of a government failure in so many ways as it was kind of, pandemics and kind of all the the biology that goes on with that. And I would love to kind of dive into that, to start talking about, before we actually had a pandemic here, what could the government have done to prevent that, or at least lessen the impact?
Yeah, this was fascinating to me as I was doing the research for this book. And as I told you offline, the sort of 3.5 different books that I wrote during the pandemic that ended up as this book. How many things, even though we lived through it, were misreported or not reported. And in doing the research and kind of laying it out, it was really such a head scratcher. Part of it, right up front, which was fascinating to me, is you had this trade deal that was signed with China, which really, I feel like, put the blinders on any sort of pushback against what we were hearing coming out of China, because it had been going on for years and years, and finally we get a win, signed the middle of January of 2020. And the president at the time is going, "Oh, I'm so excited. Oh, thanks so much for your efforts on helping with keep this new virus away." And so there wasn't sort of this pushback, other than a few people I mentioned, Rick Scott in the book, who wrote a letter saying, like, what's going on here, folks? Like, China's not really great in terms of telling the truth. You had the World Health Organization running cover for them. So we really downplayed it in the beginning. And then there were some travel restrictions that were put in place. Of course, those were called racist and horrible and xenophobic. So we didn't really get the full extent of those. But I think the biggest issues came around the area of testing and what was done for testing. If you look at places like South Korea, they had been through MERS before. They had seen the failures there from a government standpoint. So right away, they enlisted the private sector. They actually pulled them in some cases from their Lunar New Year celebration, said, "Get here right now. We're going to need you to get on top of this." And so they kind of set up testing with the private sector's help right away. There was a company in Germany, a private company, tiny company, put 1.4 million tests out like in a short period of time. And then we had this government bureaucracy where we had all these labs that wanted to do testing. And because of government bureaucracy and because of these emergency use authorizations, which theoretically are supposed to shorten the process, it created a new path where there was just red tape and red tape and red tape. And so in the beginning, the only entity that had testing that could use it was the CDC. So they had to ration it, and they had their rules about who could be tested. And these labs were desperate. They wanted to jump in, and they said, like, we know how to do this. And it just took so long that, and we did see this rationing, which is not something that you typically see in the free market. So you had those kinds of failures. And then the other one, which just again was a huge head scratcher, was around the PPP or the PPE, the personal protective equipment, where we're sending, we made this huge donation. We went around and we got all these companies to round up PPE and to send it to China instead of stockpiling it for ourselves, thinking, oh, this isn't going to be a problem. So there were all of these kind of things, where people were starting to take actions. The government pushed back, whether it was labs, whether it was people masking. One of the things people don't remember, they told us not to mask. They told us masking was harmful. All these crazy things that the media went into before they really decided to take a different set of actions.
And I think that's because pandemics are with us, right? I mean, we're going to experience, there'll be more pandemics, and we need to learn the right lessons, not just in terms of, well, how do we respond if it's here, but what can we do to prevent it? And that's what I thought that was so important, that there are things we can do that would stop the pandemic, or at least lessen it and give us a chance to get ahead of it, as opposed to being behind the curve, which is really, and to me, that was one of the lessons, and I thought so important in the book is, when we talk about government failures, talk about how do we deal with the pandemic and how do we leverage the private sector. To hear that there were so many private labs that could have put tests out there, we could have discovered it, and kind of people could have been self-isolated and contained the virus before it spread. To hear that we blew that opportunity, to me, is both depressing, but an important lesson that we need to learn.
Well, and I'll just add on to that. I mean, one of the things that was also frustrating is it's not like they didn't know about this. They had run a series of exercises the year prior called Crimson Contagion. And it was the federal government with 14, I think, different states. And the scenario that they sort of did this mock trial was almost exactly the scenario that came out. They said something came from, you know, a lab leak in China. I mean, it was like almost like a little too prescient. And this is what happened. And they ran these pandemic drills. And so they should have known exactly what it was they needed to do. They should have known exactly where the weaknesses were and the holdup and the bottlenecks in the system. And yet they still bungled it over and over again, which, you know, kind of again speaks to this Frankenstein monster that we've created in terms of big government and the inability to do anything well, let alone the actual things that they should be doing.
Well, and to some extent, the more things you do, right, outside of your core competency, the less well you'll do in your core competency. And that's, to me, one of the important reasons why we need a small government is they do important things. And if you want them to do it well, stop doing ancillary.
Everything else, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, talking about doing things poorly, and this is, I thought, really an important, we talk about the small businesses. And getting those back, the pandemic was the policies discriminating, not intentionally, I don't think, but in practice, discriminate against small businesses. Could you talk to that a little bit? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so, you know, it's up to you what conclusion you want to draw, whether this was intentional or unintentional, but it doesn't matter because the outcome is really the same. And we're in a scenario which is really, if you think about what the United States stands for and the government set up to protect the rights of the individual, the most horrifying thing and possibly the most underreported story of the last 15 months. But the government decided that they were going to give you a label and you were either essential or non-essential based on their list of what was essential or non-essential. And it turns out their list was based on political clout and connections, not really any data and science. And as we talked about in the book, and we've talked about previously, like I could get my dog's nails and hair done at a big box retailer, but I couldn't get my nails and hair done. Weed dispensaries, which had been legal, you know, for more than a couple of years in certain jurisdictions, were now deemed incredibly essential. And then the issue with this, you know, the kind of the next level issue with picking the winners and losers is that they were then not appropriately compensated for that. So, you know, under the Constitution, the concept of eminent domain is if the government wants to take or use your property for the quote unquote public good, which is basically what happened here. You know, we need to shut some people down, so it looks like we're doing something or whatever, that we owe you just compensation. And that didn't happen. So we weren't all in this together. We didn't have everybody locked down. If we had everyone locked down, if Amazon had to shut down their warehouses, if the big box grocery stores had to shut down, if God forbid the weed dispensaries had to shut down, you know, we probably would have had 2 to 3 weeks before there was a lot of screaming going, you can't do this to us, you can't do this to the economy. But because those big connected folks were allowed to, you know, continue to be essential, and some of the, you know, handful of big folks like airlines that were actually not directly affected, they didn't shut down the airlines, but they, you know, indirectly affected by some of these mandates, they got this, you know, incredible direct bailout. But what the small businesses got was this ridiculous PPP program, which was a fraction of the overall dollars that were put out and certainly not enough to compensate the taking of the property. So you had this like crazy set of winners and losers. And then what that did was enable this huge wealth transfer, because you had the small businesses that were closed, their customers were now patronizing the big companies. So those companies' revenues were growing. At the same time, you had the Federal Reserve intervening at historic levels. I mean, at this point, I think their balance sheet is just a hair shy of $8 trillion. And so not only were the company's revenues slightly higher, but the overall valuations were increased because of all the money that was flowing into the stock market and the disruption of risk into the market. So you saw last year, $3.4 trillion increase in value in 7 tech companies. 7 companies gained $3.4 trillion in value. It was a record year for access to capital, record IPOs, record value raised by special purpose acquisition companies or SPACs. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of small businesses had shuttered forever. Millions of more were hanging on by a thread. Savers and retirees were, earning 0 interest on their savings. People are out of work, and you have sort of these 2 separate economic outcomes that are 100% by government mandate, which is, again, thinking about that in the context of the USA is just completely mind-blowing.
I think this is really worth emphasizing. Is there are so many things that we can disentangle from what you just said, because what you actually have is the response to the pandemic by the government economically. There was a lot of things that didn't make sense, and if we start with the idea that first of all, so much money was spent that didn't actually have anything to do with cost of the pandemic, right? Sending out checks because there's a pandemic to people who aren't impacted made no sense. It was a waste of money.
Or people who are dead.
Right. That's right.
They could spend it.
I'm guessing no matter what the Keynesian multiplier is, if you're dead, you're not going to spend it. But the PPP program, I think, and the book talks about this, and I think it was incredibly important that, and we need to emphasize this, that all that spending was justified based on the idea that small businesses were being hurt. Right? So we're going to justify everything because everyone loves small businesses. What the government gave small businesses was a program that was complex. They didn't understand it. And so many small business owners you maybe got the first tranche of money, but they kept, upping it again and again. And they were afraid to get the second or third because it took months to find out if they can get their loans forgiven because it was a government program. So as opposed to just saying, here's money, we've taken something from you. We've said, you can't run your business. That is a taking. And we've said, instead of we're going to compensate you, which was the right thing to do. If you take somebody's property, you need to compensate them for it. We said, we'll give you a loan. And if you jump through our hoops, we'll make that loan forgivable. And the banks won't understand how to forgive those loans. So we've created this Rube Goldberg of a process. And small businesses didn't want it after a while because they couldn't understand it, let alone, and you talked about this, I'd love to spend a little time on this. So much of the PPP went to big businesses anyway.
Right. Yeah, the whole thing was like just the biggest cluster that you could possibly, if you were trying to do everything wrong, that's what came out of the CARES Act in general, and then the PPP provisions. And you hit the nail on the head. The way that it was structured was so opaque, and it's not a bailout. Like, this is not too big to fail. Oh, you did these bad things and we need to rescue you. This is eminent domain. This is our mandate. So we're giving you money to compensate. But out of all the money that was given out in the CARES Act to universities who, have already been paid by students who, by the way, got the money from the government anyway, because we mostly nationalized the student lending business, to the Kennedy Center, which was shut down and had furloughed employees and have all kinds of assets, and all of these other organizations that just got money outright for, whatever reason, because they're cronies and they're connected. And then you had these struggling small businesses, and you're not sending them direct relief money, and you have that information. You have to, as a business, you have to file payroll reports, you have to file, with the IRS. And it's not like they don't have access to that information, but you had to go to a bank, you had to jump through hoops, you had to hope your credit was okay, or you were going to get denied. And that first tranche was, crumbs, was a fraction of the overall CARES package. And because of the way they structured it, it did go to these big companies. Kanye West, who was named a billionaire by Forbes last year and unveiled his brand new collaboration with The Gap, his company got a PPP loan. Tom Brady got a PPP loan. Certainly these entities likely had other access to capital. They probably weren't going away because of government mandate. So, that was all exhausted in about 13 to 14 days. And so if you're a smaller business, you're going, okay, I've been turned down, or I don't have the paperwork, or I don't trust the government. I heard that a lot. Like, I'm not sure they're actually going to forgive this. And given the fact there were 35 rule changes between the time that it was originally conceived and I think the first month or two, it understandable. Like, you're trying to save your business. You don't have time to keep up with 35 rule changes to what should be due compensation for shutting down your business. So it's like if you were trying to put small businesses out of business in a way that was only 95% obvious instead of 100% obvious. If you're trying to get more people on the government dole and conditioning them that the government's going to take care of you, like, I don't know. I mean, Wayne, is there anything you would have done any differently to try to kill off small businesses? Because it's pretty much, if you read everything, it looks pretty intentional.
I think if you would have mandated that they had to get the loans from large banks as opposed to small banks, that might have been a way you could have made it more difficult. But
well, most of the money in the beginning actually did go to the big banks, and that was part of the problem. Is they serviced their big customers first because those are the people they have relationships with. So you can't blame them for the crappy structure of the program.
Right. Well, and also, the big companies, if you're a small business trying to survive, you don't have time, right, to go through and spend the hours that you needed to spend to get the loan. And, time matters, right? I mean, a small business doesn't have 5, 6, a year's worth of payroll sitting in the bank. They're getting, going month to month, or maybe, a couple months at best. And
you probably don't even understand it, and it's a headache, and you're like, oh, I have this file somewhere, and what's happening? Because you don't have a department, right? You don't have the economies of scale, which is why you are more vulnerable, and why shutting you down makes a much bigger difference than it would to a bigger entity.
And putting all of this in perspective, so if we know, okay, the government came in and they created a problem for small businesses because they didn't respond in the right way. They mandated shutdowns, people retracted, and logically, like I was guilty of this. You did a lot more online shopping, and when I go online shopping, I go to Amazon, I go to the big retailers. So you're not patronizing the small businesses, and so you had that natural evolution. But what I thought is particularly valuable in what you did in the book is you said, okay, the pandemic response was biased against small businesses, and that was a problem. And we still see that impact. We still see the economy is recovering, right? And we have all these things that are looking good, but you still have small businesses that are suffering. You still have small businesses, particularly in restaurants and social venues, that aren't really coming back. But you put this in perspective, and I thought this is really, really important, of an ongoing, what you call, war on small business. And I would love to, maybe we can kind of start talking about what is this ongoing war against small businesses, because everybody talks about small business and being a wonderful thing, and yet there's a war against them.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I mean, obviously, as I said, small businesses are this bastion of free markets and decentralization, and they stand as independent thinkers. And if you're trying to consolidate power, which we've seen, depending on how you want to define it, number of laws, the amount that's spending, the purview, the decisions, the areas that they're involved in, we've seen more of a consolidation of power at all levels of government, but particularly the federal government over time. And so if you're trying to continue to consolidate that power, it's much easier to deal with a handful of big businesses than to try to get the support of all of these independent small businesses who, by the way, just want to be left alone anyway. They don't want to be bothered. They just want to run their businesses. So the challenge is that, this was obviously this very brazen situation, but you can go back decades and see everything from license requirements to regulatory capture that often is painted as, oh, well, we're trying to help the little guy, which ends up helping the big guy. And the most obvious one that's happened, within the last, call it 12 to 13 years, is what's come out of the Great Recession financial crisis. The Dodd-Frank regulation that was supposed to say, bad banks, bad financial institutions, you did these bad things, we're going to have to rein you in, was so onerous that it ended up capping the new entrants of small businesses, particularly small and community types of banks. It put a lot of other small banks out of business. And then, as you can imagine, as an after effect, both because of having more costs and having to go up market and fewer smaller banks, lending to small businesses decreased multiple double digits. But what happened on the big side? Well, you have no competition now from the smaller guys. So the big guys end up getting bigger. There's more loans to big entities. In fact, I think I've got a Fred chart in the book. I think it's like $17.7 trillion in corporate non-financial debt right now taken down by companies. So we're supposed to be reining in the big banks and making sure that the little guys are taken care of, and it's given the banks free rein. And we see this all the time with every piece of legislation or regulation that's proposed is, oh, well, we want to make sure it's a fair playing field. We want to make sure that we look out for the little guy. And all it is just a cronyist guys for less competition. And that has enabled more cronyism and moved us further away from capitalism, despite the beautiful, nice sounding label that they like to put on top of everything.
That's right. Well, and you actually, by the way, taught me that. I remember one of our first conversations, and I used the term crony capitalism, and you said, Wayne, no, that's wrong. Capitalism has nothing to do with cronyism. But since we've had that conversation, by the way, I only use the term cronyism because it has nothing to do with capitalism. And
it taints it, and that's part of the problem that we contend with, is that you, even right now with what's happened with the small businesses, you have people going, well, if you can't make it as a small business, you shouldn't be in business. It's like, well, right. The government shut that down. That's not free market competition. That's like the ultimate in central planning, making decisions. So when you start having this conflation of language, which I believe is intentional, to move us away from the free market, you do start getting this conflation between cronyism and capitalism, and a whole bunch of other concepts as well, where I know you and I talked about this before too. We've kind of lost the branding around what this free market capitalism and freedom and choice actually means. And it's just kind of conflated with, quote unquote, private enterprise, which in our current situation, given the fact that the playing field has been so tilted by this cozy relationship between big business and government and special interests to some extent, it's not capitalism at all. So I appreciate you adopting the cronyism moniker.
Well, and we got to keep pushing it, right? There's no such thing as crony capitalism. Either it's capitalism or it's cronyism, but it can't be both. And I think that's one thing I love about Dodd-Frank, your example there, because that is exactly kind of where we see the economy going. Regulations in the name of small businesses put on more burdens. So when you put on more burdens, a small business can't hire teams of lawyers to comply. And so Dodd-Frank is such a perfect example where there was some issues that went on, and I think people misunderstood, but let's leave that for another
That's a whole other webinar we can have about that, right?
Exactly. But we're going to put on new regulations because we want to control the big banks and help the small banks. And, like Ronald Reagan said, the scariest words in the English language, right? I'm the government, I'm here to help you.
Right.
What's happened is the regulation, the expansion of government, right, gives an advantage to large corporations, and that's the regulatory capture you said, right? That corporations in combination with the government, they can work together, they understand one another, they're large bureaucracies, they have departments that can just talk to one another all day. If you're a small businessman or a small businesswoman, you don't have time to talk to the government all day.
Or the cost. I mean, just think about the cost that's involved. Even something as simple as insurance requirements. I'm based in Illinois, which is like, headquarters for cronyism and government intervention and anything they can do to hurt small business. And one of the things that like I want to put my head through a wall every single year is that I have to pay my employees who work from home on their computer extensive amounts of workers' compensation insurance. Like we're talking like thousands of dollars because they're sitting at home and they're going to injure themselves typing. I mean, 70% of our economy right now is a service economy. We're not running huge machine factories and whatnot. Like, why am I doing this? And so like not just the administration, but the cost. One that drives me crazy that I talk about in the book, and there's actually been some good national pushback against that as well, is hair braiding. So you have these women and men who braid hair, the same thing that mom and dads do for their kids before they send them off to school, like all across the country. They're not using chemicals. They're not even picking up a scissor. And they have to spend thousands of dollars to go get trained, which, by the way, usually has nothing to do with hair braiding, and continuing education requirements. And as you can imagine, this impacts particularly minority communities and less advantageous communities and women and people who you really want to get into the situation where they're taking control of their economic freedom and creating these wealth opportunities. And from the get-go, you're saying, well, sorry, you can't do it if you don't have these, this cash grab. I mean, it's completely discriminatory against the small guy.
That's right. And we see that over and over again, that theme of we're going to, for consumer protection, right? We're going to have occupational licensing laws in places that you just hair braiding, even hair cutting. Right? I mean, if you're a stylist, do you really need the government training to teach you how to cut hair well? I mean, perhaps, if I don't cut hair well, people won't patronize my store, and
like I'll post about it on Facebook and everybody will see my botched haircut one side up to here. And it's interesting because the pandemic really brought to light how many of these things were very silly because they had to remove a lot of these regulations to meet demands, whether it was licensing, for certain healthcare professionals to get more people who could, go across state lines or whatnot to deal with COVID, to the ultimate hand sanitizer debacle. The big manufacturers ran out of hand sanitizer because we're all very clean now. So they removed regulations so more people could create hand sanitizer. And guess what happened? We had more sanitizer. Like, go figure. The market figured that out. So it just goes to show that these are completely restrictive, and obviously we're completely insane. And the question is whether or not they're going to, go back and say, well, okay, now that things are back to normal, you can't do hand sanitizer, you can't deliver alcohol on Sunday, or whatever it is that they now took away, to try to help during the pandemic. That was just an insane law and regulation to begin with.
Well, and this is one of the big problems with big government, right? Where all of the increased spending, right? The temporary measures of spending, now President Biden wants to make those permanent. So the temporary spending becomes permanent, but temporary deregulation is temporary.
Yeah, I mean, that's the scary part is, certainly things like the tax rate get changed around a lot, which frankly is really annoying as well, because how do you plan as an individual or business owner on, big things like, whether you're exiting your business or investing in your business if you don't know what the tax structure is? I mean, the fact that we have to even navigate around that is insane. But there are so many things that they're talking about now that are difficult to repeal once you put into place, things like raising the minimum wage, on a national basis, which, we could probably spend a whole webinar on why that's insane. But once that go, you never get a point where like you raise the minimum wage and then you have an economic downturn and you lower it back down again. It only moves in one direction. Same things with benefits. You never cut those back. So those are the kinds of things, structurally that are super concerning, because once they go into effect, it is so much more difficult to roll that back.
And again, talking about the war on small business, the push to increase the minimum wage is a push that will harm small businesses and make small businesses less competitive to the larger businesses. So again, this is just part of that ongoing government's growing, we in the capital city know better. And we talk about the importance of small business, but we keep passing laws that disadvantage them in the marketplace.
Yeah,
It
and you're
just-
seeing now Amazon's jumping into the fight for 15 now. They want to see a $15 minimum wage. Of course they do, because they know it's going to, shutter a whole slew of additional small businesses, and that business is going to come to them. So that's where you get this regulatory capture and the cronyism coming into play. The other thing that we had coming out of the pandemic and central planning is that a lot of these issues they tried to push on a de facto basis. I mean, the fact that they compensated people, not just your traditional unemployment, which your employer, or depending on the state, you may also pay into and you certainly should have access to, but the fact that they did these enhanced unemployment bonuses, and that they were $600 to begin with, they continue at $300. Obviously some states have opted out, but that's a de facto way to push the minimum wage increase. And we're seeing the effects of it right now. We have 9.3 million jobs that are still unfilled, and we're still down about 8 million workers in the workforce than where we stood in February 2020 before all this disruption happened. So clearly, their specific actions are, it's not a legislative way to do it, but it's a very sneaky way to go in and to try to compete with the small business by offering, this enhanced bonus to not work. And obviously, if some of the states have gotten wise to that, but that's a really big issue, because either way the damage is done, and people are going to start having to offer more money. And we've seen it, and in many cases for small businesses, they are offering more money and they're offering signing bonuses, and they still can't get people back to work.
That's right. And they're becoming less and less competitive. And beyond that, there are many entrepreneurs who at the start aren't even making minimum wage when you take into account all the hours they put into it.
And no one guarantees their wage, right? And they're taking all the risk.
Right. And so why would you do that? And that's the kind of the sapping of the vitality, coming up with the new ideas, how to serve people better. When you say, I can make $15 an hour, without having to work hard, without having to kind of do, all of the risk I have to take. And it's not just the 15 an hour too, right? When you raise the minimum wage, somebody that was making above the minimum wage, they're going to look for an increase as well. So what you're really doing, if it really becomes pervasive, is you're pushing up the entire wage scale.
Right, and then you're pushing up the prices on the consumer to pay for it, because it's happening to your vendors as well. And then you wonder why you're making $15 an hour, but now it costs $23 for a slice of pizza. You have no more purchasing power. How did that possibly happen? I mean, it's a really challenging situation, obviously, for the small businesses.
Now, something you mentioned earlier, and you spent a couple of chapters in the book talking about the Federal Reserve. And this is complicated. I know people get very confused because it's very cryptic, and monetary policy is one of those things where, it's your eyes start to glaze over because you don't, it's so complicated. But I think it's so important because prior to the financial crisis, right, you had a Fed that only bought short-term government debt as a means to try to conduct monetary policy. And they had about $900 billion worth of debt on their books and a few other assets. Now it went from, let's say call it $1 trillion, went from $1 trillion to what you just cited earlier, $8 trillion. So the Federal Reserve has increased its footprint. And this is a way for the government to control the economy, right? Has increased its footprint 8 times. And it's not just buying short-term government debt. Now it owns mortgage-backed securities, so it's influencing the mortgage markets, it's owning corporate debt, and it's owning long-term government debt. And on top of it, it's allowing the government to issue debt, right? People keep trying to say, well, is the market isn't expecting inflation, but of course not, because the Federal Reserve is they're the largest buyer now. So they are the government debt market. So we are monetizing all of this spending. And there's all sorts of macroeconomic implications, but you talk about how it hurts small businesses the worst, or the most, I should say. And so I'd love to talk about that in terms of why are small businesses most disadvantaged from this just transformation of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I mean, it's small businesses, and it's also the little guy, the saver and the retiree. I think that the biggest thing, if you think about, when you get interest on your money, or you go out and you make an investment and you require a rate of return, that's compensation for risk taking. And it used to be that we'd have some understanding of, okay, well, I'm taking on a certain amount of risk. And if it's more risky, I'm going to make more money. And if it's not very risky, I'm still going to make something because I'm still taking a little bit of risk on. And by intervening in the market in the way that they have, buying all these securities and suppressing the interest rate, they've disrupted the notion of risk in the market. So now you've got more people who are seeking out more risk. You have bigger companies who are able to take down more capital at almost no cost. So think about, like, you go to the bank as a saver or retiree, you have your money in there, you're hoping to get something back to live on, and they're not giving you anything, but they're loaning out to these companies at very little interest cost, and they're able to go out and expand. And what it does net is it props up companies who shouldn't be there. One of the parts I talk about are zombie companies, which are these companies that don't make enough profit to be able to service the interest on their debt, let alone the principal. But because of this disruption in the market, they're hanging out and they're sucking up capital that otherwise would be used for more innovative endeavors. By the way, they also have about 2 million jobs attached to them. So that's a potential crisis there, although obviously we have a lot of people who need to hire workers, so maybe not as much as one would have thought otherwise. And it just creates an advantage in terms of the amount of capital that these big guys are able to deploy versus the little guys, and little people having to take on more risk in order to get any yield. And that's where you're seeing it kind of loop back around into the housing market. There's been a big outroar and outrage lately because BlackRock is going in and buying up single family homes and taking those opportunities away or competing with the average home buyer. And in some cases, not adding a lot of value in the process. It's not like you're funding the guy who's building the house. They're just kind of a middleman collecting a toll, and that's basically being done with taxpayer money. So if you think about it, this is part of this huge wealth transfer that's happening both on the fiscal level with the small business being closed and the money going to the big businesses, but on a monetary policy level where they're inflating the assets, they're inflating the value, they're getting more capital to the big guys and giving them this other advantage in the market. And it's just unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. And so in terms of how does it all end, there are a whole host of scenarios, many of which are not really pleasant, but it's just so hard to say based on what's happening here in the US and around the world. But that's why you have this huge crypto push. That's why you have so many people who are like looking to Bitcoin or Ethereum or these other assets, because they feel like they can't trust the government and the Fed, which is quasi-government, wink wink, we're independent,
less and less so every day.
Yeah, exactly. It's to not devalue our dollar and to not do these crazy things. And then, as you said, the whole enabling the bad government behavior to continue to spend because they're standing by ready to purchase that debt. So it's a horrible cycle, and because it is so intentionally opaque and complicated to understand by design, people aren't spending enough of time saying, like, we need to rein this in, like this is a bad thing for the economy, and this is the biggest facilitator of the wealth transfer, and we need to stop that.
I think that wealth transfer is so important, that the idea that since bank interest rates are so low, right, savers are in effect funding the low costs that are kind of going to the large corporations. And you also have retirees who are looking for interest, extending their risk. Risk and return is always intimately linked. If you need a certain amount of income to live, you need to go out on a risk profile that 10, 15, 20 years ago, no financial advisor would say you should be taking on that type of risk. But if you don't now, you're just not getting enough income to live. So there's all of these capital market distortions that we don't know how it's going to end, but there's certainly some very scary possibilities I love the way you put that, the scary possibilities that are out there if this does not end the way the central planners' mathematical models say that it should end.
Yeah, I'm not even sure they have mathematical models at this point, or that they're even following their mandate, because their mandate is supposed to be stable prices, which we know they're not. They've not stabilized the prices, and supposed to be full employment. And I would argue if you have 9.3 million jobs available and nobody's going back, that you probably have employment that's not going to be moved by monetary policy. Let's just call it like it is. So what are they really doing? They're transferring wealth. They're propping up the stock market. They're enabling government spending, and that's not their mandate. That's not what they're set up to do. And it's actually one of the chapters, particularly the one chapter about the Fed, and I talk about in other places, that I've gotten, one of the two chapters I've gotten the most positive feedback, because so many people, like you said, don't really understand it. I've spent a lot of time trying to break it down in a way that you can understand it, and more important, the implications of what's going to potentially come out in all of the ways that they're facilitating wealth transfer and reckless behavior in the financial system.
Well, we're beginning to run out of time. I would love to be able to have questions, but before we kind of open up to questions, I'd love to talk about, we kind of couch this whole thing in that we have a growth of cronyism, which is crowding out capitalism, which is kind of leading to all these kind of adverse outcomes. And so you weren't just negative in the book, right? You didn't just bring up these problems. You also talk about, where do we go from here? How do we arrest the growth of cronyism and allow capitalism to flourish?
Yeah, I mean, I think from an individual standpoint, like the very easiest thing that you can do is actually support small business. My ongoing joke is, Alexa, why does Jeff Bezos have so much money? If you're spending all your money with Amazon, like obviously they're going to do better and they're going to have more power, and then the cloud on top of it. So be thoughtful about where it is that you're spending your dollars and how you want to support small business, because you can't not support them and then wonder like why it is that they don't exist anymore. So we have a responsibility, in capitalism, to allocate dollars. I think we need to push back very heavily on regulation, certainly anything new that comes up, whether it's the PRO Act, whether it's the $15 minimum wage, whatever it is, and really think through those unintended consequences. Even now they're talking about this, let's break up Facebook. Like, I'm not sure if you separate it into Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Oculus, like they're going to have any less power or control over you. But what do those regulations look like, and who does it keep out of the market to actually compete with them? I think those are the things that we need to think through. And like we got to figure out a way to break up this duopoly here. I mean, the biggest duopoly that we have in this country is between our two-party system. And the fact of the matter is, and this book is meant as a nonpartisan book. It's political, but it's not about political parties. It's about a system that's broken. And so we need to figure out a way to get rid of that stranglehold, because the government has gotten out of control under the purview of both parties. So we just need less to be done in that arena and more to be done elsewhere. And I know, if you're somebody who likes freedom and liberty and as you're a small business, you just want to be left alone. But unfortunately, freedom is something we have to actively preserve, and we have done a really poor job in a lot of areas. We've done a good job in areas like the Second Amendment, but in other areas we've done a poor job. So I feel like we need to push back there. And then I also feel like we need to use the legal system more. A lot of people who donate spend a lot of time trying to put somebody into Congress who's going to create more laws and do those things. Like, we need to challenge the things that are on the books already. I talk about in the book how many laws, over, I think it was a 50-year period they looked at that didn't include the last 20 years, over 1 million new laws at the state level. And then at the national level, it was like 12 or 15,000 laws and like 20,000 regulations over a smaller period. Like, hundreds of those at most are challenged in court, and a lot of them are not constitutional or infringements on our rights. So I think we need to spend more time challenging those, because if we challenge those laws and say, no, you can't do that, you can't do these things that are infringing on our rights, then I think the politicians eventually will be less likely to try to put those things in place. So, those are some of the things that, and more.
Well, with that, I'd love to just emphasize again that your new book, which is really fantastic, it's called The War on Small Business. It's available today for purchase online. There it is. It's purchased online or in stores, even in small bookstores. A great place to kind of support small businesses and
yeah, if I can throw an idea out there too. So, I mean, obviously I'm capitalist, so buy wherever you want. But if you do want to take what we just said to heart, there's a store called bookshop.org online, and their entire raison d'etre is to support local businesses. So if you buy it through them, they'll actually fulfill it from a local small business retailer. So bookshop.org, it's just as easy as any other site. And they actually support the small business on the back end.
That's fantastic. With that, Evan, I guess I'd ask you, is there any questions that have come from our listeners?
No, that was the only one where to buy the book. So that's perfect.
Oh, excellent. Well, while we're waiting to see if anyone comes up with any other questions or thoughts, I guess I would love to just get more into the idea of cronyism and talk about the dangers of cronyism kind of writ large more, right? If we're saying that, because we're talking about branding of capitalism, and to me, one of the things that we haven't really discussed this yet is that, right, the answer to cronyism is less government. The answer to cronyism is we need government to play its role because it has an important role, but you got to stay within those bounds.
Right.
If capitalism is a problem, then the answer is big government. And so that gets to that kind of the branding. And to me, I think it's very important, and I would love to kind of have your take on this. If we want to kind of properly brand capitalism, then we need to do a couple of things. One of the things is the idea that capitalism doesn't mean we're not going to actively pursue a problem, right? Something that big government proponents always have is we have a problem and here's a solution. We will do X. In capitalism, the idea is not that we won't do something, it's that we're going to empower millions of people to do something. And when you empower more people, more ideas, all of us make mistakes and we need to learn from mistakes. But capitalism allows us to learn from mistakes. Cronyism, you never learn from your mistakes. Big government, you don't learn from your mistakes. You double down because that's the only way to operate, and that bureaucracy. And I think that idea of branding capitalism as it's not just letting some obscure market kind of take care of things. It's capitalism empowers people, millions and tens of millions of people to address a problem because no one person has enough knowledge, enough understanding, is brilliant enough to have all of the answers to all of our problems. And I think when we talk about branding or differentiating capitalism from cronyism, that becomes an essential component to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that the word capital and capitalism, or the concept, the Marx has kind of bastardized it by making it sound like you're capitalizing on something, which makes it sound bad instead of good, is, to talk more about freedom and choice and power to the people and, your freedom, your choice, your work, your choice, whatever it is, transparency, all the main tenets of it. And how you can bring that even to certain government institutions and entities and ideas and problems. One of the things I didn't talk about in the book because we wanted to try and stay focused, but I had in a previous draft was talking about something like Social Security and how you could bring free market tenets to Social Security. Because, obviously people who are like strict free marketeers that don't want any safety net. But if you agree, okay, well, we should have a safety net, but let's empower people. So instead of me paying my money to the government, having them spend it, sticking in an IOU, which by the way, is just like other people in the future having to pay for it because they don't produce anything in the government. What if when we paid in and our employers paid in on our behalf, like we own that money, we had a provident fund. So even if it was mandated by government, they weren't in control of the money, we were in control. And instead of investing it in a government IOU, we could actually invest it in the markets and in wealth creation opportunities, assuming it wasn't distorted by the Fed at that point in time. And then maybe you take a portion of the employer piece and you use that to fund people who aren't working. So again, we have that little bit of social safety net, but they still own it and they still have that wealth creation opportunity and they can pass it on to an heir. And then you've just taken a huge chunk of government power and control out of the equation, because there's no reason why they should be managing that money. If you're just trying to accomplish a social safety net, they can still mandate it, but we can still have that ownership and empowerment. And so to me, that's a great example of a place where you could bring free market principles to something that, you know, we feel like is important from a social standpoint, and have that objective met in a better way.
And balance kind of the two. One question that's arisen, I don't know if you have a good answer. If someone wants to get this type of information, kind of, you know, and learn more about it, is there data sources, particularly in California, which is where we're located, where someone can learn more about these types of issues?
So which issues? Because obviously, you know, the economic issues, you know, Fred, you know, you can go into the database and do those. The COVID issues, there are databases for those. Which set of issues?
Small business closure, small business, the health of the small business economy, because that data is hard to get at.
Yeah, there's a project that's sponsored by Harvard in conjunction with the Hamilton Project, that's called Open something. I don't remember it. If you type into your search engine, you know, small business closures, you'll get to this project pretty quickly by Harvard that shows it. The only thing I will tell you about the data, and this is, you know, as a small business expert, one of the things that kind of drives me crazy is people don't really understand what constitutes small business. So I'm somewhat skeptical that their numbers are high. Like, they're showing nationally that we have somewhere between 35 and 40% of all small businesses closed. Now, I told you at the top of the hour that, you know, we have, before COVID, 30.2 million small businesses. I don't think 10 million of them to 12 million of them have closed. I think that's either employer-owned businesses, which would make it around 2 million, which feels a little bit more accurate, or maybe it's consumer-facing businesses. I'm still trying to get in contact with them to go, where are these numbers coming from? But it's definitely not somebody with an agenda that's trying to push that big number. I think it's just a fundamental misunderstanding. So anytime you look at those numbers, you know, look at it with a grain of salt, but there are organizations like this that are tracking. And just remember, because we have, you know, employer businesses, we have solopreneurs, we have gig work, a lot of times those get conflated. But you can reach out to me. You know, I'm on Twitter at Carol JS Roth. I spend a lot of time on there. If you ever have questions, I'm happy, because I'm doing research on this all the time, to try to point you in the right direction, or let you know if I've pulled out, you know, new data or new sources.
Have you ever used the Yelp data on closures? I've just discovered that recently.
I did. I used actually in the book in a couple of places, and that's interesting, but that's specific to the Yelp platform. So it's a proxy for, you know, that's a subset, obviously, of all the small businesses. Not every small business is on Yelp. So it's an interesting proxy to show of their group, you know, what that looks like. The same thing, Alignable is another great group. They've got about, you know, 5 to 6 million small business owners on their platform, and they do multiple polls and surveys. So they usually get around 3,500 or 4,000 respondents. But again, it's biased to what kinds of small businesses those are and whatnot. But the findings are horrific. Like 35% of small businesses from the June rent poll don't think they can pay their June rent.
Well, and I guess that, across the sources, the fact that they're also consistent in terms of whatever the number might be, they're all grim, right? And
I mean, I don't care if it's like, I mean, the Biden White House has come out and said more than 400,000 small businesses are closed. I know that's low, but even if it were only that, like 400,000, like, oh my God, that's like 40 times the number of big businesses that exist in this country. Like, that's staggering. We've never had anything like that in history.
Right. Well, we've actually used up our whole hour. So I just one last time would love to push the book. Carol, you did a fantastic job. It's a wonderful book, The War on Small Business, purchased online, small bookstores today. And, you know, I'd love to also emphasize if you could visit pacificresearch.org to register for our next webinar, which is Tuesday, July 20th. It's with former California Supreme Court Associate Justice and retired U.S. Ninth Circuit Judge, that's a mouthful, Janice Rogers Brown, and former California Supreme Court Associate Justice, Daniel Kolke. So we're going to have a wonderful webinar. Please sign up for Tuesday, July 20th at pacificresearch.org. Carol, again, thank you so much for coming for a fantastic conversation on a really important topic.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the platform for small business advocacy. You know, as I've said before, this book is important. You know, not for me, it's not my story. This is stories of, you know, half the economy and you know, more broadly the little guy, and it's not getting enough attention. So, you know, we need to make sure that these stories stay front of mind, or you know, we're going to end up with that legislation that takes away economic freedom and just moves us further towards central planning, which none of us want to have. So I appreciate the platform, and thank you guys, and for a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for a great conversation.